The purpose of this lecture is to describe the value and the purpose of defining problems and formulating questions as part of a literature review process. So, briefly, what I'll cover is the scientific method as a form of problem solving, as well as what does problem definition mean? Specifically, how do we go about defining a problem? Next, I'll talk about question formulation. So how do you go about posing questions that are useful for solving a particular problem? And then finally, I'll talk about the benefits of good problem definition and good question formulation when it comes to literature searching and literature reviewing. So let's start with the scientific method as problem solving. So when we think of classic scientific method or the scientific process, we typically think of these steps or phases here. First, you start with formulating a hypothesis. This is where you pose some research-related question or statement about how you think things will occur. And presumably this comes from some type of problem or phenomenon that you wish to understand better. The next phase is designing the study. The following phase is to actually acquire or collect data that can be used to formally test the hypothesis or question. And then next, you're going to analyze the data and then report the findings of your hypothesis test based on the data analysis. And then this cycle can loop back on itself, as often when we come to our findings phase, this often spurs or stimulates additional hypotheses or questions we might ask ourselves or pose to the phenomenon of interest or the problem that we're attempting to solve. Now, as the header implies, the scientific method can be conceptualized as being a form of problem solving. In fact, the scientific method is essentially very rigorous problem solving. And so what I mean by this is that these are the equivalent phases in terms of problem solving as it relates to the scientific method. So as the first phase of problem solving, we're really talking about identifying and defining the problem and formulating questions. And then the second phase is determining how we're going to actually collect evidence to solve the problem and to answer those questions that we formulated in the previous phase. And then we're going to go about collecting evidence, evaluating that evidence, and then finally decide on a solution and report out the findings. So as you can see, these 5 different phases or steps correspond to the 5 different steps or phases of the scientific method or scientific process. So let's focus on this first step of the scientific method first. Given that we can now establish the scientific method can be conceptualized as a form of problem solving, we're going to be focusing on formulating a hypothesis. And specifically, what we're going to focus on in this lecture is problem identification and definition, and then question formulation, as these are important ingredients for formulating scientific hypotheses. Now, problem identification and definition and question formulation are also important when reviewing and translating scientific research, because scientific research is based on the scientific process and it's based on testing scientific hypotheses. So we want to apply a similar type of rigor and this type of logic when it comes to searching through the different literature that we have access to that's scientific or academic in nature, as well as reviewing and synthesizing that information to draw home the key points or whatever will help us answer our focal question or solve our focal problem that we wish to be solved. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the concept of problem definition, and it's really more of a process. So first, let's start with what is a problem in the first place? Well, this is a word that we often encounter, we often use, but let's give it a formal definition for the sake of this lecture. So when we're talking about a problem, we're really just talking about a gap or a difference between the current state of affairs and a desired state of affairs. So it's really you can think of it as a discrepancy, and we're trying to close this discrepancy, gap, or difference. So a problem definition then is the process of framing and diagnosing a problem for which finding a solution will bring value, and it includes describing the outcome, the context, the decision makers involved, the stakeholders involved, the scope of the problem, as well as the boundaries and the constraints. So the boundaries and constraints is really important as these relate to the scope. We need to think very carefully about what is our problem and what is not our problem. So what are the boundary conditions of this problem, or the boundaries around which we will focus our attention, or within which we'll focus our attention, and anything beyond those boundaries is beyond the scope. Okay, and this helps focus our thinking. We also want to think about different constraints that might be in play too. And when it comes to problem solving specifically, these constraints could be budgetary or resource in nature. meaning that you might not have the time or the funding to do a more rigorous type of problem solving or a more expansive type of problem definition. And so then you're going to constrain the problem definition to a narrower focus so that it's something that can fall within the resources you have available to you or within those constraints. So here's a framework that you can use when it comes to setting up and defining and specifying what your problem definition actually is. So the first thing that I'd recommend doing, and these are inspired by Chevalier and Kahn and McLean, I should note too. So they've, in each one of their books, which are really great books to check out, are both on asking questions and problem solving. And these are some of the kind of takeaways I pulled from them in terms of what are some really good steps you can take to come up with a problem definition. So the first thing we want to focus on is the problem statement. And this is simply articulating what problem needs to be solved in the first place. Okay, so that's your first step. The next step is to consider the decision makers and the stakeholders involved, or you think will be involved. So this means answering questions like who will need to make a decision or take action based on this problem? Who will experience or who experiences the problem either directly or indirectly? So who are the different stakeholder groups that might be involved or that you know will be involved? And who are the potential beneficiaries of solving the problem? So also examples of different stakeholders. So when you find a solution to this problem, who's going to potentially benefit from this? And this could be directly or indirectly as well. The next thing to consider is the scope. Okay, and so this is where you ask questions like what is and what is not under consideration. In other words, what are the boundaries of what we're trying to investigate here? What are the boundaries of that problem, that gap between the current state of affairs and the ideal state of affairs that we'd like to achieve or realize? The next thing we might ask ourselves about the scope is what are the known constraints to solving the problem? Okay, as I mentioned before, this could be and oftentimes is related to the resources we have access to in order to go about problem solving in the first place. Also, in terms of the scope, we want to think in terms of time. So what is the time frame for selecting and implementing a solution? And so we should consider this early on as well, as we want to make sure that whatever problem we need to solve is going to be solved in a timeline that makes sense for the given context. Then finally, we want to consider the goal or the goals of the problem itself in this problem-solving process. So you might ask questions like, what is the focal or target outcome of the problem? What is it that we're trying to change, in other words, or influence? Okay, this might be some metric that you have access to or that you're interested in, or it could be something else. Another question you might ask is, how will a potential solution be judged to be successful? So this is where you're going to think about evaluation. How do you evaluate whether or not different solution alternatives or a single solution alternative, whether or not it is going to actually solve the problem or whether it has solved the problem or to what extent has it solved the problem? So let's bring this to life with some examples here. So we'll start with those same components: problem statement, decision makers and stakeholders, scope, and goals. So let's start with the problem statement. So here's an example of one that's typically relevant to most organizations, which is, let's say our problem statement is this. We want to reduce voluntary turnover among customer service representatives, so CSRs, during their first 6 months on the job. Okay? So this problem statement, it specifies what our outcome is here. So voluntary turnover, which is another way of saying people who decide to leave an organization or quit the organization on their own accord. And we have a focal group here, which is the target group, which is the customer service representatives or CSR. And we have a timeline here too. So we have a goal of doing this within reducing voluntary turnover within newcomers or new employees' first 6 months on the job in this particular organization. So let's now think about the decision makers and stakeholders that might be involved. So for this sample or example situation and problem, let's imagine that the decision makers are the VP of HR in the organization and the director of HR. Now, the stakeholders that are also important to consider beyond those decision makers are the CSRs themselves, so the customer service representatives. Obviously, this is going to affect them. Anything that you do in terms of trying to influence voluntary turnover or reduce it is going to inevitably have some effect on the CSRs themselves. And then also customers too. Let's say that's another key stakeholder group, that if these are customer service representatives, they are directly customer facing. And so anything that we might do might also influence customers' experiences when working with these customer service representatives and might influence their buying habits or their decisions to purchase whatever product or service is being offered by this organization. Okay, so now let's move down to scope. Let's say that the boundaries are these. We're only concerned about those CSRs during their first 6 months, and this is implied in the problem statement, or rather it's explicitly stated in the problem statement. So one boundary is we're only thinking about CSRs in their first 6 months on the job in this organization. And we're only thinking about voluntary turnover here. We're not considering involuntary turnover, which an example of that would be the organization fires someone or lays someone off from the organization, meaning from the perspective of the employee, it was not, or rather it was involuntary that they left the organization. What are some other constraints that we need to consider too? Well, let's say that for this hypothetical situation, that we have, I wouldn't say only because this will be relative to the size of the company, but let's say we have a $50,000 budget per year that we can use towards solving this problem. And then finally, with respect to scope, the time frame for this particular solution is 1 year. And that means that we've decided that, let's say we want to see and assess whether we were able to reduce voluntary turnover among customer service representatives during their first 6 months on the job within 1 year of implementing this project. Then finally, when it comes to goals, our focal or target outcome is, as I mentioned earlier, voluntary turnover. This is what we're trying to reduce here. This is the outcome of interest. Now, in terms of an indicator of success, so how do we know when we've successfully reduced voluntary turnover enough in this case? Let's imagine that we've specified that we were looking for a 20% reduction in voluntary turnover by 1 year post-implementation. Okay? And of course, that'll be relevant to whatever the baseline turnover rate is for this organization, or specifically the baseline voluntary turnover rate. All right, so that hopefully brings together this idea of how we can go about actually stating in a very clear and kind of regimented way what our problem is, or in other words, defining that problem and providing a frame for it. So really this gets to framing a problem so that then we have a better and we can in a more targeted way go after actually solving this problem. So once we've defined the problem, it's often useful to think about what questions can we pose or formulate in order to help solve that problem. So this is where we get to question formulation. So question formulation is really a process of posing a question or hypothesis to investigate why a problem occurs. Okay? So effective question formulation contributes to understanding the problem, identifying potential solutions, and ensuring that solutions meet the needs of the decision makers and stakeholders, and that in this case, when we're thinking about literature searching and literature reviewing, that it takes place and unfolds in an efficient manner. Also, when you pose good questions, this can also make for more effective storytelling once you've completed your literature review. And the reason for this is that you can focus on, have I answered the questions that I formulated initially? And this also helps constrain your focus to what is centrally of interest in actually solving a problem. So again, we can use the questions to help investigate why a problem occurs. And these can actually be questions in the conventional sense, or it can be a hypothesis statement. So let's start with what a question is. So when we're thinking about what a question is, it's really a general line of inquiry regarding a problem or a phenomenon of interest. So examples, if we want to focus on voluntary turnover again, could include, what factors influence voluntary turnover? So this is another way of asking, what are the things that predict who's going to stay or leave in the organization? And this is essentially saying, what are the antecedents of voluntary turnover? Another question might be, does engagement predict voluntary turnover? So let's imagine that we do have a specific idea already that engagement is important, and we hypothesize or we question whether that might actually be help explain why people choose to stay or leave. Another question might be, how does engagement relate to voluntary turnover? So this is getting at a how question. So perhaps we expect that this is going to be a negative association, but this will actually allow us to more formally question this, because the first question, does engagement predict voluntary turnover? It's not explicitly asking whether or not this will be a positive or negative relationship or what the magnitude of the relationship is. Whereas when you pose a how question, it implies that you're interested in the sign or the direction of the relationship, as well as the size or the magnitude of that relationship. Now, the last two questions are, which work characteristics predict voluntary turnover? And so this implies that there's maybe a set of different variables you're interested in or factors you're interested in or you think are relevant in this context, and you want to identify specifically those that are going to predict voluntary turnover. And then finally, why do new employees turn over in the first 6 months? So in other words, why do they quit in the first 6 months? This is more open-ended, and this is another way of asking, too, what factors influence voluntary turnover. However, a why question can sometimes be a good way of indicating that, or telling yourself or indicating to others as well, that you're interested in the process. So what process perhaps unfolds that leads to new employees leaving in their first 6 months? Now let's shift gears and talk about hypotheses. So when we're formulating questions, of course, we can pose traditional questions as I just reviewed, or we can make hypothesis statements. And so a hypothesis, as I just indicated, is a statement, and it's specifically a statement about the association between two or more variables, or in some case, we think about it as the difference between two or more variables as well. Okay, so let's walk through some examples that are relevant to voluntary turnover. So we could state engagement is negatively related to voluntary turnover. And often when we're making a statement about the association, we already have an inkling of an idea, or we have an idea maybe based on prior theory, for example, of what the nature of an association or relationship or a difference is it going to be. And so here we're saying engagement is negatively related to voluntary turnover. The next statement is turnover intention mediates the relationship between engagement and voluntary turnover. So this is a way of saying that we expect that there's going to be some process that unfolds here, that engagement does have an influence on voluntary turnover, but it's through this mediator of turnover intention. So this idea that as people become more engaged, perhaps, they become less inclined to intend to leave the organization or have lower turnover intention. And those people who have lower turnover intention then are less likely to voluntarily leave the organization or have voluntary turnover. The other examples include autonomy and task significance negatively predict voluntary turnover. And this is just another way of saying that we can actually hypothesize more than one variable or being associated with another variable. We could say that it's actually two variables we expect to be related to a third variable. And then finally, new employees who participated in the formal onboarding program are less likely to quit during their first 6 months. And so this implies some kind of intervention that took place. So some employees or all employees participated in onboarding. And so what this implies too is because if you just had everybody if you had everybody participate in the onboarding program, then that would be a constant. However, we can also imply with this type of hypothesis that perhaps there's another group of people that did not go through this onboarding condition. So we can actually see if there's differences in terms of likelihood or probability of quitting after the first 6 months for those people who participated in the onboarding program and those who didn't. And this could be considered as a quasi-experimental design, for example. But in any case, this lets us get at the idea, is there some kind of intervention that we could do, a program we could implement that's going to influence the extent to which people quit the organization or leave? So one thing to note too when it comes to question formulation is that this is really iterative in nature in many cases. And the reason I say this is that question formulation often leads to answers that then lead to more questions or to more hypotheses as well. So an example of this might be, if we go back to the former questions examples, when we say what factors influence voluntary turnover, and we find that in fact, there's several factors that influence voluntary turnover, and maybe we find that it's engagement, we find that it's job satisfaction, and we find that it's turnover intentions. Well, That's a great place to start, but the reason we might have found those is because those were the variables or the data from which we had already collected. We already maybe had this in our information systems and access to those. So we were able to then correlate those or to perhaps run some type of linear regression or nonlinear regression on voluntary turnover. In this case, it would actually be a logistic regression model if we consider voluntary turnover as being a binary or dichotomous outcome. So the idea here is that we identified that there were those three variables that were influencing voluntary turnover, at least what the evidence suggested, but then we might take a more expansive view and say, well, what don't we have access in terms of other factors that we could collect data on or acquire data for in the future that might influence voluntary turnover? So in this case, we're expanding the scope of the question or the phenomenon of interest to consider other factors. So another thing I want to point to is the role of theory in all of this. Now, by theory, I mean both informal theories and formal theories. Where by formal theories, I mean these are typically scientific or academic theories that have been vetted and peer-reviewed and published in some way. And if you are interested in organizational behavior, for example, there's a number, many, I should say, different formal theories that have been published over many decades. Now, informal theories, those are ones that maybe through your own observations within your own organization or whatever environment you're working in, you've observed, or maybe other people have observed. And it's a way of saying, I think that this is how this process or this phenomenon is occurring, or these are the key factors that are at play here when we're conceptualizing a phenomenon of interest. So if it's voluntary turnover, maybe it's that anecdotally you've noticed that over the past few years, people who tend to leave tend to be dissatisfied with their supervisors, they tend not to like their job, and maybe they have low engagement. So this is essentially saying that you're constraining reality of this phenomenon of interest and to a more parsimonious view of what are the factors that you think are most relevant for understanding voluntary turnover in your organization. Okay, so theories can be a great source of inspiration for questions that you formulate because they can be used to understand or explain a phenomenon associated with a particular problem. So let's walk through an example here. So this is the theory of planned behavior. This is a classic psychological theory. It's by Asian from 1991, in which it was originally published and presented. And the idea is this, that any behavior we're interested in typically has an intention that precedes it. So in other words, people tend to have an intention to perform a certain behavior, and then this influences the probability that they actually engage in that behavior. So you can think of many different examples, and you also need to think too that just because someone has an intention to perform a behavior doesn't mean that we're actually going to do it. Now, another part of this theory is that a person's intentions are influenced by attitude, norms, and control. Where attitudes is attitudes towards the behavior in question. Norms is the norms surrounding this behavior. So what are other people doing and what are the general assumptions around that behavior? And then control. So to what degree can an individual actually influence whether or not they engage in this behavior? Okay. And so the idea, and this is an example of an implied mediation here, is that this is a process that unfolds according to the theory of planned behavior. That as attitudes towards the behavior increase or are more favorable, as norms are more favorable, and as a perception that one can control one's own behavior increase, that influences their intention to perform this behavior and ultimately the probability that they perform the behavior at all. So let's make this a little bit more real and concrete by bringing in some concepts that we were just talking about earlier. So let's say specifically in terms of a type of behavior, we're interested in voluntary turnover. And as a specific type of intention, we're interested in turnover intentions. So someone's intention to quit or to turn over from the organization. And we'll leave attitudes towards voluntary turnover, norms surrounding voluntary turnover, and control regarding voluntary turnover as is, because those are kind of implied in this concept, in this particular theory, that these have to do with voluntary turnover. So right here, if you're looking at this, this gives us great playground for starting to pose specific questions to understand this particular phenomenon of interest. And let's say our problem is going back to that problem statement that we want to reduce voluntary turnover for people for new customer service representatives in the first 6 months on the job? Well, we can focus first on, let's say, that relationship between the attitudes and turnover intentions. And so we could ask a question like, well, is really voluntary turnover, as this theory suggested, driven by turnover intention? And this theory also suggests that turnover intention is driven by attitude. So we might ask, are poorer attitudes towards work in the organization associated with greater turnover intention? And so maybe if we're thinking about attitude in terms of job satisfaction, that could be a potential avenue. Or it could be attitudes regarding voluntary turnover, whether or not someone believes that this is something that's favorable or unfavorable for the organization could influence their turnover intention as well. Now, next we might look to this next link, or the second link here implied by this theory, which is, let's say that when we're thinking about turnover intention and its association or potential association with voluntary turnover, that we could actually frame a hypothesis or state a hypothesis that's as follows: greater turnover intention will lead to a higher probability of quitting or voluntary turnover. Okay? And so this is where we can use that theory to help understand the problem and the implied phenomenon of interest. So now let's shift gears. Now that we've covered what defining a problem is and what formulating a question is in this context, we're thinking about the scientific method and specifically problem solving as an application of the scientific method and a very rigorous application of problem solving specifically. We can think about the benefits towards a literature search process and a literature review process for when we go about really doing a good job of defining the problem of interest as well as formulating questions related to it. So let's talk about those benefits. So let's start with the fact that a well-articulated and well-informed research question or hypothesis can guide the literature search and review process. So for example, if our question is this, our question that we're interested in is this: does engagement predict voluntary turnover? This gives us some important information here. As you can see now highlighted in red, or rather the red-faced font, engagement and voluntary turnover are two concepts or variables or constructs of interest here now. And so when you're doing your literature search and review, and if this is your question, you're going to want to investigate and do a literature search on engagement as a construct, voluntary turnover as a construct. Okay, so you want to define and investigate each one of these constructs here. So the question is implying this now. It tells us where to find information and what information to look for. And it also is telling us we need to look for information regarding the association between engagement and voluntary turnover. So this means doing a targeted search where maybe you're saying searching for engagement and in the sense of Boolean logic, and engagement and voluntary turnover. So finding those scientific or peer-reviewed sources in which both engagement and voluntary turnover appear either in the body of the manuscript or in the title, or both. So let's also talk about the benefit of asking good questions or formulating good questions and having good definitions surrounding your problem or framing your problem well. Well, this can also add contextual information or boundary conditions to a question, which can be really useful for the literature search and review process. And so what I mean by that is, let's start with that original question and let's think about how if we really do a good job defining the problem, we can actually add some constraints or some boundaries to this questions, which might help us find a more targeted population of interest or a targeted context or situation of interest, whatever the case might be. So here you can see the question is now, does engagement predict voluntary turnover for customer service agents within their first 6 months on the job? So you can see here in the red font that I've added in this extra contextual information that introduces some boundaries here. Okay, so does engagement predict voluntary turnover for customer service agents? Okay, so we're interested now in a more specific population. So we're interested, does engagement have an association with voluntary turnover, but specifically for customer service agents? And we're also interested in just the first 6 months on the job. So we're interested here in newcomers to the organization. Now, the value of this is if you are searching in an area that has a ton of research already related to it, such as the relationship between engagement or attitudes or job satisfaction in relation to voluntary turnover, which I can say there is quite a bit of literature on that. if you add in this extra contextual information or boundary conditions to your question, it can help constrain your search. Now, I'm not saying that you're necessarily going to find information specifically related to engagement and voluntary turnover for customer service agents in the published peer-reviewed literature, but it's worth looking into. And it's also helpful to think about, are there, even if you can't find specific literature related to engagement and voluntary turnover in customer service agents as the population, what can we find out about customer service agents that would be worth taking into account regarding, do we expect that this relationship would be of the same magnitude, or would it occur at all for these customer service agents? And then the same goes for putting that time frame in terms of the first 6 months on the job. Are we going to find that specific combination of customer service agents within their first 6 months on the job as a population and situation of interest in the peer-reviewed literature when it comes to that association between engagement and voluntary turnover? Not necessarily. However, this is good to keep in the back of your mind, because it can also, when you think about what you found in the literature after doing your search and as you're reviewing it, it can give you some insight and help you understand, okay, what do we know based on this literature review and what do we not yet know? And how comfortable do we feel generalizing what we found if, let's say, we were only able to find does engagement predict voluntary turnover in a very general sense across many different types of occupations and jobs, but not for customer service agents specifically, and not necessarily within their first 6 months on the job. Well, this is going to be a limitation of how well you can generalize what you've found to that target population of interest. Okay, so in short, what it's doing when you do add these contextual boundaries to your questions, it's going to focus your literature search and review process, which can sometimes or often make it more efficient. You might have to play around with these boundaries because in this contextual information that you add to a question, as you don't want to make it too restrictive where you can't find anything. So sometimes you have to narrow the focus and then back it out slowly until you can start finding relevant information. And in doing so, when you try to make things as specific as possible and as tailored as much for the context of interest, you're increasing the likelihood that the solutions and recommendations will generalize to the population or conditions or the context of interest, okay? So what is the benefit of problem definition and question formulation on storytelling? Well, a well-articulated and well-informed question can actually guide interpretation and storytelling when it comes to communicating to a broader audience what you found in your literature search and review process. So what it does is that a good problem definition and a good question formulation process is going to keep your interpretation and storytelling process focused on answering the focal question and solving the associated problem. Sometimes we get really excited about things and we start going down the rabbit's hole in terms of looking and searching for a bunch of other things that are tangentially related to our focal question or to our focal problem. Well, that can be a fun exercise to go and to explore other avenues that kind of are tangents off of our focal question or problem, but it's not very efficient. And it's going to make for a more murky story if you're not staying on target. So by focusing on answering the question and solving the specific problem, you can really hone in your story to what it is that you think matters most. And this ensures that the story being told answers the original question posed, which is really, really important, of course. And it can be a way to outline or to create structure for your storytelling process, whether that's in writing, whether or not that's a talk, whether that's a video, or however you're deciding to communicate this information. And just remember to keep your stories so that it's clear, that you focus on communication, and that you focus on connecting with the audience as well. Okay, so just to briefly sum up what we've covered today, we talked about the scientific method as a specific type of problem solving, or vice versa. You can think of the really rigorous problem solving just being an application of the scientific process or method. We next talked about, well, how do you go about framing or defining a problem, which we call problem definition? And I offered a framework for you there that you can follow through with your own literature search and review process. And then I talked about the value of posing specific questions to help you solve a problem of interest. And this is the question formulation phase. And then we finished up by talking about what are the benefits of doing your due diligence and coming up with good problem definitions and doing your due diligence with the question formulation as well. This wraps up this lecture on defining problems and formulating questions.